Well, we're starting today into the book of Exodus. And Exodus, of course, tells us how 600,000 Hebrew men escaped with their wives and children from slavery in ancient Egypt. And that dramatic event, of course, launched a nation and ultimately two religions that continue to shape the world today. And at the center of it all was one individual, Moses. And yet, we're told, now the man Moses was very humble, more than any man who was on the face of the earth. And I just think that description of Moses stands in such stark contrast to the character of the vast majority of leaders today, right? And even throughout history. I mean, because they tend to be the exact opposite. And we look down through history, and the arrogance of leaders has had disastrous consequences. And yet, it's like we just continue to follow these people, hoping that one of them will be different, hoping that one of them will be better, and it doesn't happen. And so I think we desperately need to understand what humble leadership is and how it works. And I think Exodus 1 through 18 can show us. But you might ask, is that really what these chapters are about? I mean, if you read commentaries or listen to other Bible teaching on these chapters, people tend to get wrapped up in a lot of other details, like the historical details, the pinpointing the people and the dates and locations, and others focus on developing the theological ideas of salvation from the story. And as important as those topics are, I think they often lose sight of the fact that these chapters really highlight the personal story of Moses. And so we'll examine some of those other issues as we make our way through these chapters, but we have to see that those things all contribute to understanding who Moses is and how he responded to the circumstances that he faced. Now, of course, critics will claim that Moses had very little to do with the book of Exodus. Many people will say that the first 5 books of the Old Testament, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, that they are just a collection of different source documents that were compiled long after the time of Moses. Some even claim that no such person as Moses even existed. But when you look to the New Testament, to the Gospels, there are several instances where Jesus quotes from these books and refers to Moses as the author. So I think we should consider these opening chapters of Exodus to be, in some sense, an autobiographical account. And as great as Moses was, he doesn't gloss over his sins or his shortcomings. He presents this very honest account of his struggle to believe and to serve God. And so I think he shows us the kind of person, the kind of people we need to follow. And furthermore, even though he serves this very unique role in history, I think his story helps us learn to humbly lead people in our own spheres of influence, in your family, in your work, in the life of the church, and even in the community. So as we make our way through these chapters in the coming weeks, I pray that God will shape our lives for his glory. Of course, when you think of slavery, you might think of chains, used to restrain a person, limit their freedom. And yet, as you read through the Exodus, there's no indication that the Egyptians used physical chains to oppress the Hebrew people. In fact, strangely enough, the first mention of a chain in the Bible is to a golden necklace that the Pharaoh of Egypt gave to Joseph to signify his power when he made him second in command. But I think that whole concept of interlocking links, it helps picture for us a foundational idea in humble leadership. As Americans, we sort of love the idea of the self-made man. There's a lot of leaders who portray themselves as independent, out-of-the-box thinkers. They entice people with new ideas, new goals, new methods. You even see that in the church, and people minimizing connection with leaders of the past and convincing people just to look to them alone. But humble leaders see the bigger picture. They think of themselves as links in a long chain, recognizing and appreciating those who've gone before and preparing the way for others who will come after. And so as we begin Exodus here in chapter 1, we're going to go down through chapter 2, verse 10. I think Moses helps us see how his life fits into the big picture of God's story. He records 4 examples of humble leadership. They're like links in the chain leading up to him. They just prepared the way for his life, because nothing he does would have been possible without those people. And yet, their actions weren't necessarily spectacular. I mean, they responded to the circumstances of their lives in ways, honestly, that should characterize every believer in God. And so as we walk through this passage this morning, I want to encourage you, first of all, give thanks for people that the Lord's raised up in your life who've modeled these sorts of characteristics for you. And then aspire to be that kind of person for others, to be a humble leader. The first example that we come to in the passage, Moses begins with people who were waiting for the promise of God. You know, we don't like waiting, right? I mean, we expect immediate results, immediate gratification. And so we tend to choose leaders or to follow leaders who seize the moment and create a stir, regardless of the long-term consequences. But humble leaders, in contrast, they're like farmers planting a seed that's going to bear crops for years to come. So they exercise patience that's grounded in a long-term perspective. In the case of the people mentioned here in Exodus, the promise that God gave them was just beginning to be fulfilled several centuries after their lifetime. So there's this incredible sense of perspective of the long term here. So we start in Exodus 1, verses 1 through 7. Take a look. It says, "These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, each with his household: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah; Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin; Dan and Naphtali, Gad, and Asher." Then it says, all the descendants of Jacob were 70 persons. Joseph was already in Egypt. Then Joseph died, and all his brothers and all that generation. But the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. So that's where the book of Genesis leaves off. But we need to go back and review a little bit. We go back to Genesis 12. It records the original promise that was given to Jacob's grandfather Abraham. You may remember Abraham was from the city of Ur, an ancient city in what's now southern Iraq. But the Lord called him to go to Canaan, right? The region that's now modern-day Israel. And he promised to give Abraham the land and to make him a great nation so that all the families of the earth would ultimately be blessed through him. And so if we look to the New Testament, Hebrews 11, 9 through 10 sums up Abraham's life by saying, by faith, he went to live in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. So as you read through Genesis, you find that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, like the passage says, they were living in tents. They never had a claim in the land. And yet they could have attempted to seize it from local people. I mean, Genesis 14 tells us that Abraham has had enough servants in his household that they were able to overcome invading armies when his nephew Lot had been taken. Kings of those local city-states even offered to give them land, but they chose to wait upon the Lord, upon his promise. Now, as Moses reminds us here in Exodus 1, Jacob had 12 sons, and I think you probably know the story. It was a messy situation. He had 2 wives and 2 concubines, so there was a lot of strife, a lot of jealousy in that household. And Joseph was Jacob's favorite son, so the other sons sold him into slavery and told Jacob that he had been killed by a wild beast. But of course then, Genesis tells us that after many years, Joseph rose to a position of great power in Egypt. so that he was able to help the nation through this time of great famine in that part of the world. And the famine could have wiped out Joseph's family, but he was there. He was able to provide for them. And so as we're told here in Exodus, they arrived with just 70 people and began to multiply into a multitude. And yet, that wasn't the final fulfillment of the promise. There was so much more to come. They wouldn't actually return to the land until after Moses died. And then the ultimate part of that, the blessing of all the families of the earth, that really begins to be fulfilled through Christ, as Jesus dies on the cross to open the way of salvation for all the nations. And then even still, we're still waiting for the ultimate fulfillment, for Christ to return, to reign as king from a new Jerusalem and a new heaven and earth where there's no longer any suffering. So my question this morning is, just to start us off, is that your hope? Are you seeking that promise? Are you looking for that? Are you praying for the kingdom to come like Jesus told us to? Because I think a lot of believers right now are confused and are clamoring, trying to gain power here and now in all the wrong ways. Are you willing to wait and to hope? Are you setting an example of patient, confident faith for future generations? Because that's the example that the patriarchs set, waiting for the promise. Next, Moses turns to the example of those who endured opposition for God. No one likes to encounter hardship, right? We like things to be easy and comfortable. And particularly when that opposition comes from people with ill will, people who want to inflict difficulty and hardship. And so we tend to look for leaders who will fight back against that sort of thing. Right? But humble leaders recognize that God is able to use fiery trials to accomplish his good purpose. We find this great analogy in nature. Some evergreen trees, their cones, won't open and release their seeds to germinate unless they're exposed to intense heat. And so when we see these forest fires in the news out west, it seems so destructive, and yet it's necessary. It's part of life there. And so in the same way, God works through adversity in our lives to cause us to grow spiritually. And in the case of the people of Israel here, to cause them to grow numerically. Take a look at Exodus 1, 8 through 14. It says, "Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, 'Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. And if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land.' Therefore, they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh's store cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel. So they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick, and in all kinds of work in the field. In all their work, they ruthlessly made them work as slaves." So this passage raises some of those chronological questions. When did this persecution begin? Who was this Pharaoh? Since one of the cities there was named Ramses, some scholars think that this must have occurred during the 13th century BC because there were some pharaohs of that name. But the problem with that view is that 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 1 tells us that Solomon began to build the Jewish temple there in Jerusalem in the 480th year after the Exodus. Scholars generally agree that the temple construction began in 966 BC. So some people would say, well, the 480 years, that's just a sort of a metaphorical thing. It's symbolic of 12 generations. But if you take those numbers at face value, then that places the Exodus sometime around 1446 BC. So maybe that city was just named after a different Ramses. That's certainly possible. And yet this date, even whichever view you choose of that, it doesn't really tell us how early this time of slavery began. Because if we go back to Genesis 15:3, God had already told Abraham that his descendants would be afflicted for 400 years in a foreign land. So, that time frame places, by the early date that I talk about there, that places it all the way back in the 19th century BC that Joseph went down to Egypt. And so you think about it, the people of Israel needed some time to multiply to the point that the rulers felt threatened by them. But then that slavery apparently lasted for centuries. And so the throne of Egypt passed through several dynasties over that time frame. So it could have been any one of those that had basically forgotten how Joseph had helped the nation and then turned against the people of Israel. The question is, though, why would God allow them to go through that? If they were his chosen people, why did they have to suffer? Why did they have these possibly centuries of slavery? Well, the passage really tells us there, doesn't it? It says the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied. Think about it. They had the power to rise up and leave. They could have done that. The Egyptians were certainly afraid of them rising up. But if they had done that, if they had left too early, the nation presumably would have been much smaller. And apparently God didn't think that there were enough of them to take possession of the land that he was going to give them. And so this oppression served some practical purposes. It kept them separate from the nation of Egypt. They could have just intermarried and integrated and really disappeared as a people. But instead, they were kept separate, and this kept them united and ready for the time when God raised up the right leader. Now, I'm not sure. I kind of doubt that the people of Israel understood that God was doing that through their suffering. And yet somehow they endured. They persevered. There's no record of any sort of rebellion. I kind of wonder if they remembered Joseph's words to his brothers. Maybe those were passed down, where he said, "You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good." That's Genesis 50, verse 20. And so, we see that same principle even in church history, that God often uses times of hardship, times of persecution, to purify the church and to spread the gospel. You see in the book of Acts that the church was sort of clustered in Jerusalem, and it's as they're persecuted that they spread out the way that God had already commanded them to do, the way that Jesus told them to do, to the other nations. And then it happens again with Rome. Christians tend to stay within the Roman Empire, but when Rome falls, the gospel spreads to Europe. So God uses persecution. He uses hardship. Not just in a corporate way, in a group way, but even in our lives individually. So do you believe that? Are you willing to endure hardship and opposition for God even when you don't understand how he's using it in your life? I think that kind of faith has a powerful influence on those around us and on future generations. And so the example of the people of Israel here in their slavery in Egypt encourages us to endure, to persevere. The third example Moses gives us is of people standing in the fear of God. We often talk about fearless leaders, but a leader that fears nothing is bound to be reckless, to be unpredictable. A humble leader, on the other hand, is one who finds courage and stability by being anchored in truths that are heavier than the pull of the storm. No matter what powerful people may threaten to do, God's power is far greater and his condemnation far worse. And so we should fear God, and the fear of God is what enables us to stand firm. Here in Exodus 1:15 through 21, Moses recounts the stand taken by two godly women. Take a look. He says, "Then the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, 'When you serve as midwife to the Hebrew women, and see them on the birth stool. If it's a son, you shall kill him. But if it's a daughter, she shall live. It says, but the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live. So the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, why have you done this? And let the male children live. The midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them. And then it says, so God dealt well with the midwives. And the people multiplied and grew very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. Now, I think scholars and Bible teachers sometimes miss the point of this passage. Some people get caught up in debating whether the names of these women were Egyptian or Hebrew. Some wonder how there could only be two midwives for this multitude of people. They could have just been leaders of a group. Some make some very awkward attempts to explain what an Egyptian birthing stool would be and how it would work. I'll spare you the details on that one. Some debate whether the response, and this is more significant, whether the response that these women give to the king was a lie, and if so, how God could bless them for it. I tend to think perhaps maybe they were just being openly sarcastic. Certainly the nurses I know would respond that way if they were asked a question like that. So the point here is that Shiphrah and Puah feared God more than they feared the king. Right? They weren't just good moral people who valued life. They didn't even have God's law at this point, right? The Ten Commandments had not yet been given. But maybe they could have known the command that God gave to Noah after the flood. There in Genesis 9:6, it tells us that God said, whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for God made man in his own image. So at the very least, I think we can say they probably understood that God is the creator of all life, and that everyone will answer to him for how we treat people as those made in his image. We saw recently that the book of Proverbs has a lot to say about fearing God. And I think Proverbs 14:26 captures the spirit that we see in these women. It says, in the fear of the Lord, one has strong confidence, and his children will have a refuge. Now that goes against the way we think about fear, right? Because we think of fear as something negative. We tend to think of confidence as the absence of fear. But that's not what this verse says. Right? How does this work? Well, the fear of God, on one level, it exposes our sinfulness. It kind of undermines our confidence, exposes our faults. But as the proverb says, God is also our refuge. We learn more about that later in the New Testament, that Jesus has died for our sins so that we can be reconciled to God. And the idea is if your relationship with him is right, then you have no reason to fear anything anyone else might say or do to you, because your eternity is secure. And so that outlook gives your life a genuine stability that is influential, that impresses future generations. We need to stand in the fear of God. One more example. Fourth, Moses shows us people trusting in the providence of God. Of course, the world's approach to leadership is all about exerting control, right? To ensure the desired outcome. And we all have a tendency to be pulled in that way. And maybe the best example is in parenting, in families. We talk about that phrase, the helicopter parent, who hovers around their children and tries to control everything in their lives. But humble leadership is more like training a kid to ride a bike. You can put on training wheels. You can take them off and run alongside them for a while, but eventually you have to let go. Right? And so as scary as it may seem, those who serve God, we can trust in his sovereign control. We can come to that point of letting go and trusting him to take care of the situation, the circumstances that concern us. Moses' parents were forced to take that step a lot earlier than most other parents. And so we continue the story here. If we look at the last verse of chapter 1, verse 22 says, "Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live." So we're moving into chapter 2 then. We read, "Now a man from the house of Levi went and took as his wife a Levite woman, and the woman conceived and bore a son. And when she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him 3 months. But then it says, when she could hide him no longer, she took for him a basket made of bulrushes and daubed it with bitumen and pitch. And she put the child in it and placed it among the reeds by the riverbank." And it says, "And his sister stood at a distance to know what would be done to him." So apparently they were able to keep the child's birth a secret for 3 months. But then somehow someone must have figured it out. And if they resisted, if they outwardly opposed the king's command, then they and their children would probably all be executed. And so they had no other choice but to comply with Pharaoh's command. Of course, his intent was for people to drown their infants in the Nile River, but he didn't quite specify that, right? He just talked about casting them in, and so that's what they did. But this mom did everything she could to help her boy survive. She built him this waterproof basket, right? She places it in the reeds so that hopefully it won't get swept out into the middle of the current, right? But then she has to let go. She has to trust for God to work in those terrible circumstances. Exodus 2, 5 through 10 tells us what happened. It says, "Now the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, while her young women walked beside the river. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her servant woman, and she took it." And it says, "When she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby was crying. She took pity on him and said, 'This is one of the Hebrews' children.'" It tells us, "Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, 'Shall I go and call you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?' And it says, Pharaoh's daughter said to her, 'Go.' So the girl went and called the child's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, 'Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages.' So the woman took the child and nursed him. And then verse 10 tells us, when the child grew older, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, because, she said, 'I drew him out of the water.'" So God orchestrated this remarkable outcome. The Pharaoh's daughter found the baby and felt pity for him. I mean, here's the thing, she was willing to defy her father's wishes. Now that detail fits in interestingly with the early date that I mentioned for the Exodus, because some scholars who accept that view think that this woman might be a lady named Hatshepsut, the daughter of Thutmose I. She was a smart and powerful woman, and later, after her husband and half-brother Thutmose II died, she was married to her half-brother, just to make clear there. She became one of the few women to reign as Pharaoh. And she had a daughter, but she was unable to bear any other children. So perhaps she thought that having a Hebrew son might eventually allow her to exert influence over the Hebrew people, to increase her own political power. Well, that might explain why she gave him a Hebrew name. In a way, she was memorializing, maybe even mocking her father's murderous policy. This is the boy that I drew out of the river. So, in the short term, of course, Moses was returned to his family. Pharaoh's daughter even paid them to take care of him. But there again, their time with him was limited. I mean, they'd have to let go again, maybe by the time he was 3 or 4 years old. They'd have to entrust his future to the providential control of God. So are we willing to exercise that kind of faith? Or are we always just fighting to have control? Think about that. What kind of when all you do is fight for control, what does that say? What kind of influence does that have on future generations? So the humble leader recognizes there's a time to let go. Trust in the providence of God. So I think those who believe in God should be humble leaders because we see the big picture, that it's not all about me, that this is God's story, that we're just links in the chain. And so we should be those who wait on the promise of God and who endure opposition for him, who stand in the fear of God, and who trust in the providence of God. So do you believe in him? Are you trusting in the Lord? If not, I encourage you to start down that path of the life of faith. Look to the Scripture and learn more about him. Great place to read would be the 11th chapter of the New Testament book to the Hebrews. Kind of follows up on a lot that we've talked about today. It provides an overview of the Old Testament by highlighting the faith of key individuals. Hebrews 11. And if you are a believer, do you need to focus on one of these examples that we've talked about today? I mean, these stories are brief, and yet much more could be said about relating to God in these ways. But it still gives us a starting point, a way to change your outlook, that when we face challenging circumstances, we can remind ourselves of those people, of their faith, of how they responded. We can choose to view ourselves humbly in relation to God's plan and all that God is doing throughout history, just like they did. Maybe you know someone who's modeled those sorts of characteristics for you. If so, praise God and express your gratitude to him, because, I think that's sort of what we have here. That's what Moses has done. He's recorded these examples. He's highlighting the way he was impacted by these people who went before him. May God help us become faithful, humble leaders in his great story.